In one of the longest-running science fiction series in network TV history, FBI special agents investigate unexplained, mind-bending cases known as X-Files. Though the government is convinced that the outlandish reports are false, conspiracy theorist Fox Mulder, David Duchovny, and realist Dana Scully, Gillian Anderson, for most of the series, stop at nothing to prove that the truth is out there. Series creator Chris Carter also serves as executive producer of the thrilling pop culture phenomenon. The X-Files speaks to the 90s. It is not the only show that could be said to speak to the 90s as a decade. Certainly, it was not the most successful show. ER was a much larger commercial success, while Homicide: Life on the Street has enjoyed a longer-lasting critical reputation. The Simpsons is still going, decades after the 90s came to a sudden and traumatic end. There are any number of television shows that could credibly be said to speak to the 90s as a decade, from Twin Peaks to Friends. Still, The X-Files captures so much of the moment on film. It was a long moment, but then The X-Files was a long series. Although nowhere near as impressive as the runs of institutions like Law and Order or CSI, very few television shows can make it to 9 seasons while feeling like they only barely outstayed their welcome. The 90s felt like a long pause, an awkward silence in a crowded room when the chatter dies down and everybody realizes that they don't quite recognize any of the people sharing the table with them. Of course, even the label, the 90s, is something of a misnomer. That long pause roughly coincides with the last decade of the 20th century, but outlasts even that. It began with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the last enemy had been vanquished and a few brave souls proclaimed that civilization stood at the end of history. It ended with the destruction of the World Trade Center, when new enemies, or perhaps old enemies, revealed themselves to be spoiling for war. By this measure, the 90s ran from November 1989 to September 2001. Close enough. It was the unipolar moment, the point at which the United States had vanquished all of its opponents and emerged as the global superpower. It was a transitory state, one that could never really last. However, it afforded an opportunity for rest and reflection. Without a clear enemy demanding a unified front, people could ask tough questions and demand hard answers. How had it come to this? What now? Where does everybody go from here? Those are not easy questions to answer. The X-Files was very much a reflection of these contemporary anxieties. "I want to believe," was the mantra of the show. It adorned the iconic poster hanging on the basement office, speaking to the optimism and idealism of Fox Mulder. The X-Files was the product of an increasingly cynical age, but it was always romantic. The show desperately wanted to believe in something. Love, trust, faith. The democratic process or the basic decency of other people. Aliens would do, in a pinch. Sometimes those other concepts were just as intangible. The X-Files was rooted in 70s cynicism and paranoia, afforded 2 decades to ferment. Little Green Men revealed that Samantha Mulder had been abducted while she watched the Watergate hearings with her older brother. The 18-minute gap in the Watergate tape recurs throughout the show, echoed in the 9-minute gap in the pilot and in the 2 9-minute gaps in Tempus Fugit and Max. Many of the production team came of age during that troubled era, with the 90s affording the opportunity to revisit those themes. Those gaps in the Watergate tapes came to stand for gaps in the collective memory. The X-Files spent its first 7 seasons unearthing a secret buried history, tracing a web of deceit and deception from before the founding of the United States to the present day. Episodes like Darkness Falls and Detour suggested that the European settlers were still strangers in a hostile and alien land. The Calasari implied that the European settlers had brought evil with them to this new world. The colonization plot at the heart of the show was either history repeating or poetic justice. The show suggested that the United States was compromised by original sin. Shapes suggested that the first X-File was tied to Native American culture. Anasazi had Mulder finding a train car full of dead bodies buried on a Native American reservation. The show was steeped in the imagery of Manifest Destiny, from the train car labs of Nisei and 731 through to the biological imperative to push westward and drive. Across the show's 9-season run, the genocide and exploitation of the indigenous population came up time and time again, perhaps most succinctly in The Gift. However, the show suggested that the sins ran much deeper than that. The modern conspiracy was not rooted in Roswell, as most conspiracy theories would suggest. The Blessing Way and paper clip implied that most of the country's modern sins could be traced back to the end of the Second World War. The third season really emphasized this idea of forgotten and glossed-over history, drawing attention to how the United States space program was largely made possible by war criminals. It was a bold suggestion on the 50th anniversary of the end of the conflict. This obsession with the past played as ghost stories. Piper Maru and Apocrypha suggested that ghosts were merely voices of conscience reaching out from the past, perhaps reflecting the first season's fascination for revenge from beyond the grave, narratives like Shadows, Lazarus, Young at Heart, Roland, and Born Again. This theme might have only rippled through the central mythology, with Scully receiving a phone call from a dead relative in Christmas Carol, but it was important. Mulder finds himself literally confronted by the ghosts of his past in the truth. Then again, that was the luxury of the 90s. The X-Files had the comfort of examining history from a position or relative comfort. As shows like Fallen Angel and Existence argued, there was no enemy left to Venki Sh following the end of the Cold War. Without an opponent against which political consciousness might galvanize, there was ample time for reflection and consideration. The X-Files repeatedly suggested that the current generation were stained by the sins of the parents. This was rendered literal with Mulder. So much of the X-Files could be read as a metaphor for a son raging against the world inherited from his father. This is apparent in the strained relationship between Fox and Bill Mulder, set up in episodes like Roland and Aubrey long before the latter character ever appeared. It also finds expression in the conflict between Mulder and the cigarette-smoking man. Talitha Kumi broached the idea that the cigarette-smoking man might be Mulder's biological father, a notion confirmed 6 years later in William. While it was rooted in 70s anxieties, the X-Files spoke to the 90s. Chris Carter seemed to inherently understand the decade and the zeitgeist, with the series hitting on any number of important ideas at just the right time. There are quite a few moments of uncanny parallel development to be found across the run of the show, with Carter hitting on a clever, an important, idea at just the right moment, the show speaking to audience in perfect harmony with events around them. Immaculata was perfectly in step with 90s anxieties around contamination and infection. It was broadcast at around the same time that Outbreak was released, speaking to some underlying cultural mood. The list subtly touched on issues related to race and incarceration in the United States, broadcast shortly after the verdict in the O.J. Simpson trial brought all of those issues back to the surface. The seventh season's preoccupation with unreality mirrored that bubbling through pop culture in films like The Matrix, The Truman Show and Dark City. The X-Files was a quintessentially 90s television show, speaking perfectly to the cultural consciousness. The show captured a lot of the aspirations of 90s television. Television was still a relatively young medium at that stage, still uncertain of its own identity or even its artistic sensibilities. The X-Files embraced the idea of film as the closest relative to television, with the mythology offering blockbuster thrills on a television budget for free on a weekly basis. The X-Files looked sleek and polished, cinematic and bold. While television had traditionally been considered a writer's medium, the X-Files embraced its directors and allowed them to make the show their own. Directors like Rob Bowman, David Nutter and Kim Manners were just as important to the voice of the show as writers like Chris Carter, Vince Gilligan or Darren Morgan. Carter even encouraged his writers to become directors, developing something of an auteur theory of television episode production. The X-Files attracts a lot of attention for nudging toward serialization with the mythology, telling a long-form story over years and reinvigorating a storytelling style that had gone out with Dynasty and Dallas. This is a perfectly valid observation, but it is impossible to praise the mythology without acknowledging its shortcomings. The mythology was frequently stretched and contracted, distorted and contorted.